Hi, my name is Michael Egan. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History here at Mac, and I specialize in the history of science, technology, and the environment. A combination of things which make me sort of, in a lot of ways, a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde kind of instructor. On the one hand, I suppose, I'm interested in human efforts to sort of, and unshaking faith in our capacity to control the forces of nature through ingenuity, through science, through technology. And on the other hand, looking at environmental history, obviously, examining how those forces of nature sort of bite back and make it clear that they're the ones in charge. So my work sort of fits between those and very, very significantly in a 20th century global history kind of perspective. Right now, I'm actually working on two projects, both of them based largely in the 20th century. One, a history of global environmental sustainability, and the second, a history of mercury pollution in the 20th century and how science, policy, and nature sort of come together in that account. And with that in mind, I mean, I don't have a home base in the 20th century. I don't work around a national geography in my history. I do sort of float around. In terms of historical methodology, I'm a follower. I follow stuff. I follow ideas. I follow knowledges, forms of knowledge. I follow things. I follow people, and I follow elements of the physical environment. Most recently, again, with mercury. So what I really want to do today, I guess, is rather than trying to put together a lecture on some specific aspect of science and technology in the 20th century or some environmental narrative of the 20th century, I think I'd be more interested in presenting a story based around how science and technology and nature, the physical environment, shape or drive or influence our way of thinking about the 20th century world and the human condition therein. So it's a little bit different perhaps than a concerted story, but I guess the challenge then becomes one of how we think about or how we can think differently about the world around us. Well, at the risk of upstaging or alienating my colleagues in the department, I would assert that science and technology are two of the most profound drivers of 20th century history. Just compare 1900 to 2000, just the differences over the course of that century. And I think all so many dramatic changes have occurred thanks to and because of science and technology. Over the course of the 20th century, we went from the bicycle to the microchip, from Edison's light bulb to nuclear power. From the Wright brothers experimenting with early flight to landing on the moon in 1969. We went from trench warfare in World War I to the nuclear bomb. These are colossal changes. From the phonograph and the radio to the internet. A good deal of history requires that we students of history, not just students, but everyone who studies history, practice a great deal of empathy. That we try to put ourselves in the past's shoes and evaluate it based on their sensibilities and not our 21st century sensibilities, or judging it from our contemporary perspective. So put yourselves in the shoes, for example, of someone at the beginning of the 20th century for whom electricity would be a relative novelty. There's no penicillin yet, no contraceptive pill, the kinds of things we take for granted, no smartphones. I mean, the kinds of things that we take for granted that make up our everyday lives aren't present at the beginning of the century under discussion or under examination in this class. And another luxury I guess we enjoy as historians is the bird's eye view of the 20th century. We can look over the whole scope and scale of what's occurred over the last, in our case, 112 years, but 100 years. In the span of roughly a decade, in the middle of the century, and this is a lovely metaphor for me in the history of science and technology, human ingenuity, the history of science, acquired both the capacity to destroy the world through the development of nuclear weapons, and within a decade of that, within just 10 years, also the capacity to unlock the secrets of life, the discovery of the structure of the DNA and the double helix. And in a lot of ways, I think that's a wonderful metaphor for thinking about the 20th century, both the ups and the downs in terms of what humans have achieved and how we think about the world differently, both before and after this middle point, right in the middle of the 20th century. Another way to think about this from, again, to sort of suggest or stress the significance or the importance of science and technology to the 20th century world and its history, writing in 1963, the philosopher Derek de Solla Price observed that there were more scientists alive and working in 1963 than all the scientists combined throughout all of human history, combined. The aggregate from the dawn of time right up to 1962 was a smaller number than the great number that were working in labs, in institutions across the world in 1963. It's an incredible statistic, an incredible notion, suggesting of just how important science has become in the modern world. And that number holds true today, so that even including de Solla's number in 63 going on forward, in 2000, in the 2010s, we have more scientists alive and working today than at any point in history and in aggregate over all of history, which is suggestive of just, again, how important science and technology has become. But it's also an historical trend that deserves careful consideration and attention. Because at the same time, I want to stress that science and technology don't just emerge out of nowhere. There's no eureka moment in the history of science and technology. Instead, from Einstein's theory of relativity to the steam engine, from the impossibly small to the impossibly huge, science and technology are contrived by humans interacting with other humans and with the world around them. Science and technology are always social endeavors. They don't happen on their own. They don't drive human history in and of themselves. They're a part of human social history. So going back to this notion of this incredible number and this growth in science and things, it's important, I think, as historians of the 20th century to ask why there were so many scientists. Where did they come from and what were they doing? And as I like to tell my History 2EE3 course, it's a course offered in the fall, on science and technology and world history, that knowledge reflects the material circumstances of its conception. Which is to say that money and power typically dictate what kinds of things get known, what kinds of scientific work is pursued. It's why we can create, over the course of the 20th century, a highly technical arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, but we can't accurately predict tomorrow's weather. It's why we can put somebody on the moon and know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the sea floor here on Earth. It's why we're better at genetically engineering food than slowing down rampant desertification across the planet. Science and the questions we're inclined to ask, the questions we're inclined to think are important, the questions we're inclined to fund are driven by social factors. And not just social factors, but by interests with means and power to do so. So both the examination and influence of money and of power in shaping what we're inclined to investigate and what we're inclined to know is important. At the same time, there's no question that we've learned an incredible amount about the world and the world around us in really exciting and provocative ways. So there are two ways to look at this, and I always like to sort of leave questions and stories with a variety of different endings. There is this wonderful story, I think, based around the capacity for human ingenuity. It's the 20th century is representative of just about humanity at its best. What we've achieved over the course of the 20th century in science, technology, and medicine has been unrivaled by any society in any time past. At the same time, we've presented ourselves with a whole host of unforeseen problems, a whole host of social and cultural inequalities. This course is based heavily on global conflict, and science and technology have been at the forefront of that through so much of the 20th century, indeed all of it. It's really been a driving force in shaping the identity of the 20th century. So that's the Jekyll side of me, I suppose, in suggesting that by and large, the history of science and technology is one that traces, for better or for worse, the human faith that we can shape the world around us, that we can control nature. But here's a fact, and it might be more of a biological fact than a historical one, but it has distinct historical ramifications. And I think it's one historians need to take far more seriously than we typically do. For all our scientific and technological ingenuity, we remain inextricably linked to the same old umbilicus. We're still hooked up to air, soil, and water. Without these three things, humanity, life on this planet, doesn't exist. We can't dodge that. Human politics, human economies, human life cannot outrun the biophysical limits set by the environment around us. It's a fact of life. And it's such an important fact that it's one we ought to consider as we think historically about the world around us as well. It has to be not just in the backdrop, but at the forefront of everything we do. We can't dodge this. We can't avoid it. And so this is the Hyde side of me that's interested in the environment and how the environment plays a critical role. And that statement, I guess, comes across as me sounding more like an environmentalist than as an historian, perhaps. So let me try to situate this more effectively in some discussion of 20th century history and what environmental historians do. So if the physical environment plays such a profound role in shaping the parameters of human activities, we need to recognize its historical significance. And I'd argue that our current environmental awareness, and who can escape debates right now really over global climate change or biodiversity, green, eco, and sustainability, they're all around us. I would argue that this is part of an historical process that stretches through much of the 20th century. This is largely a 20th century discussion. My current work on environmental sustainability seems to point towards its inception in early economics, mid-20th century economics, and the beginning of the recognition of limits to growth, which evolves into a sort of a global political discussion over what we can and can't do. And sustainability and sustainable development enter the lexicon by about the 1970s, but the discussion is exclusively a 20th century one in a lot of ways. And through this lens, through this story then, we see another chapter or another perspective on the history of science and technology, which I suggested a minute ago was one of incredible ingenuity, incredible sort of progressive development over the course of the 20th century. And from an environmental perspective, we can often see that so many of these stories are based around the tragedy of unforeseen consequences or unanticipated problems. The development of the petrochemical industry during and immediately after World War II has this incredible effect on consumerism and production and the economy in all kinds of ways. But what we fail to realize is that we are emitting all kinds of chemicals and materials into the air that have had long-term and profound environmental and detrimental problems that they fail to degrade the way natural organisms tend to. I'll talk about lead in gasoline in a moment, but I mean a whole series of examples where making the world better, more efficient, faster, smarter has led to making the physical, natural world around us sicker, poorer, and more depleted. And I think that's, again, a story we need to keep in mind. One classic example of this is Thomas Midgley, who I'm sure is not someone you hear about on a regular basis in a 20th century world history class. Well, Midgley in the 1930s invented Freon, which was the first CFC. And CFCs were used in refrigerants, solvents, and spray propellants. Midgley's Freon replaced dangerously flammable and toxic gases that were previously used in refrigeration and made air conditioning practical. Think about summers here without air conditioning. This is in a lot of ways Midgley's baby. He really took the first steps towards this. So the virtue of CFCs is that they're stable and they react with nothing around them. This is a good thing until they drift up into the stratosphere, and there they interact with UV radiation, which breaks them up, releasing agents that rupture the ozone layer. The ozone absorbs 99% of the ultraviolet radiation entering the atmosphere, and is composed of oxygen. So CFCs, while here on the planet, have wonderful capacity to serve as safe, stable forms of refrigeration and other things. Once they get up into the atmosphere, they pose all kinds of problems. And again, the depletion of the ozone is an environmental, a global environmental issue and a product of the 20th century that we are still sort of wrestling with its legacy. Now, I don't want to suggest at the same time that Midgley, this American scientist from the 1930s, is solely responsible for the hole in the ozone, because he's not. Rather, there are a whole series of social factors going on and things. But it does raise an important question about whether innovation or application sows the seeds of environmental destruction. And that's something, again, that plays out across a whole variety of different themes and topics in the 20th century. So is Midgley's invention the problem, or is it the people who made widespread use of it without considering the potential environmental hazards? Where's the problem there? And that's a really interesting question that I delve into in a lot of my classes. It's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of question, but it does have profound historical implications. Just as a side note, Midgley was also the character who introduced tetraethyl lead into gasoline, which was essential, again, in improving the performance of early automobiles and the effectiveness and efficiency of the internal combustion engine. As a result, though, lead was spread throughout the environment in copious amounts, raising all kinds of health and environmental concerns that weren't really addressed until the 1970s and 1980s. According to the world historian John McNeill, Midgley had, and I'm quoting here, more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth history, which I think is a great line. So there's this tension here between science and technology on the one hand and environment on the other. Important industrial improvements, no question about that, but they wrought havoc on the environment in ways that we're still having to sort of pay off that debt or address that debt. So what does the 20th century history look like if we bring the physical environment into the foreground? Rather than just the backdrop to the human drama, what happens if nature is a part of that story? How would we engage in storytelling and analysis of the 20th century a little bit differently? Well, we might start to reevaluate what kinds of stories we're inclined to tell and what kinds of interpretations are important. For example, what if I told you that the 1st British Regiment deployed in World War I was sent to Basra, which isn't in Belgium, where the theater, the Western theater, the European theater of World War I took place. It's in Iraq. That kind of changes our perspective a little bit, doesn't it? Because it nicely contributes to the theme of global history and a world war on the one hand, but what on earth were the Brits doing in Iraq when it was a battle against Germans in northwestern Europe that was really sort of the driving feature of every story we've ever heard about World War I? Why is Iraq the first British theater of the Great War? And that's an environmental history story. And it's one that I think, again, I'm challenging you to shift your perspective just a little bit here to think about a larger 20th century history of oil. What does 20th century history look like if oil is your centerpiece, if it's oil you're following around the world? Well, that shapes things quite differently. It puts different points of emphasis on things. It removes different kinds of idealisms and introduces new kinds of economic and political and geopolitical kinds of priorities in ways that our stories get changed just a little bit. And not better and not worse, but I think in interesting ways that deserve some kind of investigation. And how do you pair that with some of the other things you might be looking at? Just very quickly, the British were desperate to pursue and protect their interests in the emerging Persian oil fields. Again, at the beginning of the 20th century, oil was still a relatively minor fuel source. There was no question it was the future, but to butcher a bad analogy, the future wasn't now yet. But Churchill, who is the head of the chief of the Admiralty in Britain, and others were very conscious that this was going to be a necessary energy source, and they sought to protect it. While the Germans, meanwhile, were trying to extend the Orient Express that famously went from Berlin to Constantinople down to Baghdad and then further down to Basra on the coast, which would give them a port certainly to South and Southeast Asia, but also very quick and easy access to an incredibly rich power source. So in a lot of ways, looking at this from a fossil fuel or an energy history kind of perspective, which I think sort of fits into a larger rubric of what environmental history is, we have a larger story here that I think shapes and changes everything. Now, please don't write on your exam that oil was the reason that the British got involved in World War I. It wasn't, but it was a central feature in the larger strategic thinking. at the beginning of World War I in 1914. So a different kind of perspective, and it's not a part of the story that we typically examine. But with the benefit of hindsight, the benefit of being almost 100 years further down the road, we can imagine just how significant a role oil has played over the course of that century. And here is an early feature of that chapter is British engagement in World War I in Iraq, of all places. And I think in a similar kind of context, we can breathe new life into the rationale behind the Japanese invasion or bombing of Pearl Harbor at the beginning in World War II. Certainly, it was a preemptive strike against the Americans. It's what dragged the Americans into the war. The United States was really reluctant to be involved in World War II until Pearl Harbor. So, in a lot of ways, you can argue that the Japanese accidentally poked the wrong bear at the wrong time or did it poorly. But there was a rationale here, which was to monopolize on the Pacific rubber plantations, which would give the Japanese total resource dominance, global resource dominance over rubber. And think about the centrality of rubber to any war effort. A Sherman tank consists of 20 tons of steel and half a ton of rubber. Every single tank requires a half a ton of rubber for it to work, or else it's grounded. It's not going anywhere. There's almost a ton of rubber in heavy bombers. On the battleships at Pearl Harbor, more than 20,000 different rubber parts made up the ship. More than 160,000 pounds all told. Every hose on every ship, every valve and seal, every tire on every truck and plane was made of rubber. Rubber is wrapped around every inch of wiring in every factory, home, and office in the United States. Conveyor belts, hydraulics, inflatable boats, gas masks, rain gear, all rubber. Mr. Firestone, whose name should be synonymous with rubber in a lot of ways, in 1926 made the offhand remark that New York could be blown into the water tomorrow. But that would not have nearly a significant effect on the American economy and political strength as the demolition of their rubber industry and rubber factories. That's 1926. So again, this strategic effort by the Japanese to sort of knock off any kind of opposition to their control over the southeastern rubber plantations in Malaysia and things. And as I get asked every time I sort of bring this up in a class, well, what about synthetic rubber? Well, here's another part of the story, is that synthetic rubber, bringing back science and technology a little bit, different companies had experimented with synthetic rubber in the 1920s and 30s, and it just wasn't very good, and certainly wasn't as good as the real thing. And it's not until the late 1940s and 1950s, prompted by this fear of the Japanese controlling the rubber plantations, that American scientists really sort of dig in and develop a more viable form of synthetic rubber. So that story comes later, and it's a direct response to this fear of being cut off from a valuable resource. And we talk about sort of North American concerns over oil independence through the latter half of the 20th century. From the 40s through the 60s or 70s, there's a real concern about rubber independence, which is finally solved through the development of synthetic rubbers. But at the beginning of that story, it's as prevalent a concern for national security as oil becomes later on over the course of the 20th century. So on the one hand, I guess it's easy to dismiss these sort of very quick sort of thumbnail sketches and me making a sales pitch for science and technology and environment, and argue that natural resources have always played a role as economic issues, and this perspective doesn't really change the study of the past. But I want to impress on the importance on where these resources are and how we have come to depend upon them, because I think that these are stories that we need to take more seriously as well, because that shapes our reading of the past. Or we can treat both of these accounts as part of a larger technological history of power, both in its military but also in its energy iterations, if you think about it. Think about the role of automobility in the 20th century, the growing dependence on automobiles, to the point where at the end of the 20th century, everything you want to buy before the internet takes over is in a strip mall. That you can't function in many North American cities and even in many European cities without an automobile. That wasn't the case at the beginning of the 20th century. And And it raises questions about how dependent we've become upon these various resources. Or we could even take this another step and construct an environmental history of fossil fuels. One of the enduring characteristics of the 20th century has been the rapid and alarming and wildly unsustainable rate at which we've been consuming organic material as fuel. That's taken required millions of years in its production underground, and we've used it up almost in a century. And I don't say that again as an environmentalist insisting that we be scared, but rather think about that the levels of consumption based on science, technology, and environment that have radically transformed the practice of what we do as a species on this planet over the course of a single century, which is really, really quite remarkable. I'll make another small plug for a third-year course I teach on the history of the future. What next? And one of the things I've always been interested in history and looking at science and technology and indeed the environment as well is this planning for the future. Well, what do we do next? If we're at a point here at the early stages of the 21st century where we're concerned about fossil fuels and their exhaustion, we're concerned about global climate change and its relationship to that, the question becomes what next? Where do we go from here? And there are really interesting historical questions we can be asking through the 20th century of how people planned from a food perspective, from an energy perspective, from an economic perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, that really sort of shape our planning for the future. And for me anyway, the human drama is so much wrapped up not just in what people did, but what they thought they were doing. And I think that slight shift in perspective, I think, allows us to be a little bit more sympathetic or empathetic to understand what they thought was going on. And this notion of planning, I think, sort of lends itself to that we are very much the products, for better or for worse, of much of the planning that occurred over the course of the 20th century as well. Well, just as we are bound to air, soil, and water for life, we remain largely bound to natural resources to make our economies and societies function. And more to the point, I think it offers a fresh angle, lens, or perspective to our analysis of the past. What would a focus on the automobile shape? How would that shape a retelling of the last century? Or a 20th century history of water, which I think could be a really interesting study of where water is, who has access to water, who doesn't, what countries have a lot of water, what countries don't, and how does that shape sort of geopolitical but also sort of socioeconomic relationships in different places? Who has clean water? Who doesn't have clean water? I think raises some interesting questions. What would a 20th century history of oil look like, as I suggested? Or for those so inclined, just think about the historical significance of physics or physicists and their place in the 20th century. Just think about the creation of the atomic bomb, their influence on molecular biology, their confidence and almost arrogance about being able to solve all the secrets of life, the secrets of the universe, which really sort of developed over the 20th century into a wonderful tale, not just of triumph, but also obviously of colossal hubris at the same time. Well, frequently, how we shift our points of focus or emphasis doesn't make history more or less correct, but it provides us, I think, with opportunities to question and reinterpret previously held notions. History is not about memorizing a bunch of names and dates. It's not about that kind of stamp collecting. Instead, what we're really trying to do is think about how we understand the past as best we can, and in what kinds of contexts. In a lot of ways, I think it's kind of putting a finger on the pulse of the human condition, both past and present, understanding where we came from and how and why, based on interpretation rather than just, again, what happened when and where. And I think we get lost too often in just that. The stories that we read and tell are the stories that make and define us. They're a centerpiece to our identity. History charts change and continuity over time and place, and individual historians can set or focus their microscopes in different ways to yield fascinating and at the same time markedly different points of analysis. And for me, I guess there are no more interesting stories than the triumph and tragedy of the human imagination and the belief that there's nothing humans can't know and nothing that humans can't build. And if you juxtapose that faith in human ingenuity, and I'm a big fan of human ingenuity. With the very real limitations imposed by the physical environment, you get some fascinating stories, remarkable innovation, and some appalling catastrophes at the same time. Combined with the environmental realities that surround us today, I feel this kind of history arms its students both with an appreciation for the value of the past as an intellectual endeavor, but also the critical importance of historical context and its relevance in contemporary debate in the 21st century. As I've sort of indicated, so many of these historical problems are still in front of us today. We're still wrestling with them and coping with them. And rather than leaving them just to the engineers or just to the policymakers or the economists to weigh in, my strong feeling is that in order to solve some of these problems, and they are huge, we need the most and best information we can acquire. And it might come across as seeming a little self-serving for an historian to say this, but I think his history and historical context provide really critical tools in solving those problems or being a part of the conversation. So I'm a big proponent, as I look at the history of science and technology and environmental history, of history having contemporary relevance, being a useful part of the contemporary discussion.